Hi, fam. What's going on? Lance, how are you, my friend? Thank you for coming
Sup?
back on.
Doing well. How are you?
We're good. We are on the back end of an illness. So I literally told Kelsey yesterday, I said, I don't care how I feel when I wake up. I'm over this. I'm like, I'm going to work out. I'm going to have a full day of work. I'm tired of just feeling like poop and napping and not doing anything. So I am just
Yeah,
going to force my body into being
that's
healthy again.
it's a very Jocko Willink kind of mindset
I
there.
know. I know. We'll see how it goes because it could backfire, but
Take life by the horns.
we're good. Today is the first day of feeling not like a human zombie, so I'll take it. And then, yeah, hopefully actually get some productive things done today. Maybe get a lift in would be a nice change of pace. Not feel like a total sludge. But
That'd
yeah,
be
man,
great.
how was your Thanksgiving?
I was good, other than a little bit of sickness after Thanksgiving. I'm not sure if it was the dinner meal or the breakfast before, and then the 5.5 hour direct flight from New Jersey to Phoenix
Mm.
that we sat on the runway for another half hour. That was, I thought 4 hours was my max, and now I'm sure of it.
Yeah, I told, because we drove, and I told Kels on our drive back that I'm instituting a hard 4 hour limit. If we're going someplace that is farther than a 4 hour drive away, we fly. I
Or,
hate driving.
yeah.
I can't stand it. Like, it is just such a waste of time. It takes forever. You always end up in traffic because there are idiots that get in wrecks. And I'm just sitting there being like, if I sat on a plane, I could be doing something with my time. I could be reading. I could be working. I could literally be doing anything other than just sitting here driving.
Yeah, yeah.
That's really what it
The
is.
thing that the thing that gets me about that, I'm okay with driving a little bit because I like listening to books. But if I'm if for whatever reason I haven't slept at like my maximum amount of hours, I get so tired. Just battling the daily fatigue. And when you're driving at 5 p.m. and you're sensitive to caffeine, like you got to have some caffeine to not die, but that means you're not going to sleep that
Yeah.
night, and it's just going to make the problem worse. So I totally feel you there.
Yeah, it's the trade off. It's like, okay, a night of zero sleep or no sleep ever again. Which do I choose? Um, yeah, it's just an efficiency conversation. Just want to make sure I'm using my time appropriately. But let's
Yep,
dive in,
I
dude.
feel you. I feel
We're
you.
not here to talk about my driving woes and how much I dislike doing it because it feels like it's a massive waste of my time. Today, we're going to chat about a very interesting topic that hopefully you, the listener, find interesting, which is the question: is stretching dead?
Mm.
And we talked about this a little bit off air. It's something I think we're both quite passionate about. And so, again, sometimes I think we just get stuck in our little bubbles and we forget what the vast majority of people are still believing and doing. Right. But I have not been a fan of the stretching camp for a very long time. And God, I wrote a blog post when I was interning at Eric Cressy about this, actually, like way back in the day. Because
Wow.
when I came up in the system, it was still very much, all right, you squat, power clean, bench. If something's tight, you stretch it. Right. So I always had air quote tight hamstrings, and people were just stretching me all the time. And I was always injured. And like all these tactics and strategies people were using were not helping. I was not getting any better. Right. You go to physical therapy and they're like, well, you just need to stretch more because you're so tight. None of that worked at all. It was an enormous waste of time. And so when I was in college, I started to be like, this doesn't feel like the most optimal way to approach this problem. I don't feel like this whole stretching thing is working. I know all of you are telling me I need to stretch, but I'm stretching my nuts off and this is just not making a difference. So from that point on, I just basically blazed a path to figure out, okay, I think this is dumb. So what is a better alternative and a better option? And so, yeah, since then, I have not been a humongous fan or proponent of stretching unless it is like very, very, very sniper detail focused. I think it makes sense in very particular use cases. And we're going to dive into this way more. But that's just a quick backstory. I have been anti-stretching for probably about 8 to 10 years of my life, And fun fact, when I stopped stretching and we stopped stretching all of our fucking clients, funny thing is they started feeling better, they started moving better, and we started alleviating more problems. But I will hand this over to you. Maybe if you have a backstory on stretching, and then we can just dive in and talk about this from a less dogmatic standpoint and try to approach it from a, as evidence-based as we can, because there's not really tons of literature in this realm, unfortunately.
So, yeah, I mean, my experience with stretching growing up was like PE class or ice hockey practice. It was like, if we're going to warm up, we got to do our stretches. So we would all sit center ice and we would all just go through the same stretches. And I would actually do them. I could feel the stretch and I thought it was preparing me. Coincidentally, that led to like that, and really heavy lifting led to like the least healthy my body has ever been. I'm not going to totally blame it on the stretching. Some of it was the heavy lifting that my body just was not made for or ready for. And some of it was probably the food I was eating back then too. So we live and we grow. But I just like at this point, I don't think stretching is always bad. I think really intense stretching is almost always bad. But I think that there's almost always a better alternative. And like we were talking about you driving and trying to be efficient with your time, like stretching just doesn't fit into my busy schedule unless it's, sitting and thinking time. But at that point, I don't know. I don't really like doing the stretches. So I think to me, it's just suboptimal, let's say.
I think it's maybe if we start with what is the goal outcome we are chasing? Like, what is it that stretching is trying to do for us? Let's start with that. And then we can backtrack our way to say, maybe this isn't the best strategy for us to use.
Yeah, so I would say that when people are stretching, generally they're trying to increase the range of motion in some realm. The biggest hang up that I have with that is if you're, we got to look at various types of ranges of motion, right? There's 3 planes of motion. You got the sagittal, you got the frontal, and you've got the transverse. In general, people are most limited in the frontal and transverse, but we don't have a lot of stretches for that. We've got a lot of sagittal stretches. Specifically, the hamstrings are kind of like the biggest target here. And in my experience, even when somebody's, we'll say hamstrings are limited, they're not really limited. They just can't access it, right? If I don't have the strength in my quad to pull my leg up, and I'm testing my hamstring flexibility, then I can't access it. My hamstring might be long, but if I don't have another force to overcome it, then I can't, that is way more important. And we would call that test an active straight leg raise if you're going to try to Google it.
And then if I was just going to jump in super quick there, because I think the hamstring is another great example of maybe just not asking the right questions. I think that's an important example that you just mentioned. But we also have to consider the positioning of the underlying skeleton. What is the position of your pelvis? Because this is one that always blew my mind. And I'm like, I don't understand how people don't think about this, because it's actually very basic and straightforward, right? If you just take a pelvis and it rolls forward into your pelvic tilt, if you want to use that language, your hamstring attaches on the back of this structure on the ischial tuberosity. If that thing rolls forward, the distal attachment site's not changing. It's on the back of the knee. That's not going anywhere. Its proximal attachment site is moving farther up, is more superior. So your air quote short, tight hamstrings are actually perpetually lengthened. It's like taking a rubber band, pulling it, and then holding it on stretch all the time. So your hamstrings aren't short, they're actually long. And then when you go to test them on a table, you're starting however many degrees behind the starting line. So they're going to look short. I just don't feel like I don't understand why that's such a large logical jump for people to make. If it's just, we don't want to ask that question because it's an easier answer just to say, oh, look, this is short, go stretch it.
It's an added layer of complexity. So I've been thinking about this more as I've been writing these way too long articles on my website, hoping to do a real deep dive into a couple, I think, popular but misinterpreted topics. And the one I'm about to finish is on butt wink, which is essentially a 20,000 words on hip mobility. And the last one that I did is maybe a little more pertinent. It's maybe equally pertinent. It's about quad stretches, and I've thought through this. And so oftentimes when somebody comes to me, they say X or Y feels tight, but tight is a vague descriptor and totally unhelpful if you want to diagnose something, because tight muscles can be tight for multiple reasons, right? And that's that extra layer of complexity that I think people aren't understanding. Like you're saying, a muscle can be tight passively because there is tension within it. Think like a rubber band, the ends are being pulled, and that makes something tight. But muscles can also be tight because they are unrelenting, because they have a descending motor drive that tells it to stay tight. Mm-hmm. It's essentially a contraction, a low-level amount of contraction that increases the stiffness in a tissue. It's not a passive stiffness, and it can be overcome. And that's why you have somebody who comes and sees you for an evaluation, James, and they say, my hamstrings are tight, and you say, okay, just bend over and touch your toes like 40 times, and now they can touch their toes, right? Those things can change really quickly because the motor system, the brain, and the rest of the motor system, that stuff can change in an instant.
Well, this is a really important point here. That, again, something that doesn't ever come into the conversation that really drives me bananas. A muscle cannot carry tone without the influence of the nervous system. Like, period. Right? Yeah. So if we have these really tight, toned up muscles, we should maybe look someplace else other than the muscle in question. Because I think the two examples you just gave are, okay, this muscle either feels tight because, hey, the two attachment sites are getting pulled away from each other like a stretching rubber band. So therefore, it's not necessarily the muscle, it's where that muscle is attaching. Or part two is if we do have this more toned up low-level contraction, that is a nervous system related influence. You are not going to stretch that out of the muscle. I'm sorry, you just are not, right? The extreme example in this realm is, if you ever get your hands on a cadaver, I've never touched a cadaver that is missing range of motion. Right? Because there's no influence coming from the brain. The muscle carries no tone. So it flops all over the place.
Yeah.
And it's when you start playing with this realm and you start saying, well, what happens if I give maybe some more external compression someplace and you start getting back range of motion? Or I give you some more side abs and I get back range of motion. Or maybe I teach you how to take a good breath and we get back some range of motion. We start to realize that this is a much more complex world than just, hey, if it's tight, stretch it, which probably causes more problem than, not probably, I think that does cause more problems, because I'm just going to try to perpetually stretch an already stretched, already toned up muscle. Like, that's where we potentially create issues down the road that then make things harder for us in the long run, because now it's another layer of complexity I have to overcome if I create, air quotes, some form of like a pathology at a joint or in tissue because I overstretch this thing, right? If we can think back to the sleeper stretch realm in baseball when that was so popular of, oh, you're missing right IR in your shoulder, let's just sleeper stretch that thing until like we get it back, which hopefully no one is doing anymore. If someone is telling you to do a sleeper stretch, please slap them in the face and walk away, because you're just going to fuck up your shoulder. Like, that's not the reason you don't have internal rotation. I'm sorry if that bothers you, people, but just some tough love sometimes. But yeah, please continue.
There's a bunch of directions where we can go here, and when I'm on a call like this, my working memory just goes in the toilet. So I got to write these notes down, and then maybe we can talk about them all. Yep. Who knows if I spelled that right? So I was planning on moving on, but you have a really good point here where if I'm stretching something that's already tight, what are the negative effects of that? So we have to, I mean, I don't know. I think to fully understand this problem, you need a very broad and deep understanding of the anatomy. More so broad, like you don't have to get too specific about this. I think a shoulder is the best example here. So let's say I've got tight shoulders because I'm a human and I listen to Rebel Performance Radio, and that means that I bench press. So I have tight shoulders. Like that is all of you. That is me. That is James. That is all of us.
I'm going to break
right?
everyone's heart for a second here. I'm going to be willing to bet that there's not a male listening to this episode right now that has full shoulder flexion. There are probably some women out there, some females in the crowd listening, that will have full shoulder flexion just because you are maybe on that laxity side of the world and a little bit more loosey-goosey and you just go forever, right? But for the males in the crowd, sorry to break it to you, I would be willing to bet none of you have full shoulder flexion. Here's the deal. Well, I'll tell you exactly what it is. You're going to have limited shoulder flexion. You're going to have limited IR at every joint in your body. You're not going to have hip extension, and your hip flexion is going to be limited as well. I'm willing to bet 95% of you fall into that bucket right there.
I think that's probably true.
Yeah.
Based on the clients from Rebel that I've worked with, I can confirm your probabilities.
It's probably more than 95%. I haven't assessed somebody that doesn't fit that bucket in years.
Yeah. I think that's probably true. But we're pretty stringent about what kind of mobility you have access to.
Yeah. Sorry, continue.
So there's that. So we're trying to understand the full. I did want to play devil's advocate for a second here. So I trained this kid who is like, I don't know, he's maybe like 5'8", almost 300 pounds. He had calves the size of thighs. Like I've seen some like more petite women have calves that size or have thighs that size. It was crazy. I was like, this dude's going to be so stiff. And I laid him down and I tested his shoulder flexion and he had full shoulder flexion. He was super pathological. He should not have had full shoulder flexion though. And the reason I can say that is because he didn't have the other things that would say, hey, this is a body that moves really loosely. This is a body that, can demonstrate all of its flexibility. If I asked him to stand up and show me full shoulder flexion, there ain't no way he would do that or he would have pain, right? And that's where we have to think about if I have this active or this resting tension, like we were talking about, this descending motor drive that is just unrelenting, then I take that and I try to stretch those muscles, but I don't do anything about that nervous system. So I still have that nervous system input. What happens is that piece of the muscle does not let go. Let's say, for example, I have a lat that has a lot of drive, right? And it won't let go. And I try to stretch the lat. So then all I do is I don't create any more space where the lat crosses. But what I do instead is the next thing that is supposed to stop movement starts to give way. And that tends to be the passive restraints of the joint capsule. In the context of the shoulder, I get this multi-directional instability because the joint's not even that deep, right? Most of my stability is coming from moving things at the right time, like the scap and the humerus, they have to move together. And it's coming from the passive restraints of the capsule. So if I let go of the capsule, then it doesn't shake around this much, but it's like you're, shaking around a golf ball on a tee. And I have the golf ball starts to leave the joint. And so that's how I can demonstrate, quote, full shoulder flexion, even though I don't really have, I wouldn't want to load in that position.
Do you feel it is safe to say that a muscle will perpetually carry this tone because of threat, perceived threat by the brain and nervous system? Right. I am incapable.
Absolutely.
I am incapable of finding references and feeling safe and stable in the world around me. And so an easy way for me to find joint stability, air quotes for people not watching, is to just fucking turn on every muscle around that joint. And now I'm going to get some semblance of joint stability, right? Because all the muscles are on. But when I start seeing those things, my mind immediately goes to threat. This person cannot orient in space. They don't really know where they are. And so we're turning on all the muscles as a protective mechanism just to try to keep the joint safe. Do you feel like that's a fair assessment of this?
Yeah, absolutely. The when you think about the place that my head goes, so I did a podcast yesterday too. And we talked about this on that one.
Oh,
but
nice. Who are you with?
When you, it was More Train, Less Pain with Michelle Bolin and Tim Burchard.
All right. Nice.
It was a good one. It was actually a lot of fun. So we can listen to that one later when we're done with this one. A concept that I come back to often. So I try not to remember specific rules, but more so principles, right? I don't want to go to somebody's course and then say, okay, this is how they do it. I want to say, this is, given what I know about the world and physics and chemistry, these are the decisions. This is likely what's going to happen. Again, we're playing probabilities here. Think about I'm going to use myself as an example. So my hips are super mobile, like more mobile than most people that I know. And it's because my hip joint is super shallow. So my hip joint kind of looks like a shoulder joint. And what that means is that I have less coverage of the ball going into the socket, which means there's less area to disperse forces through, which also means there's less coverage and less keeping it in the joint and less stability. So I tend to do really well with low force activities like yoga, or even for me, it's not really yoga because I don't really like it, but it's more like a conditioning type workout where I'm using submaximal loads, not trying to get very strong. And what that, if I try to do those higher force activities, what I need for more stability to take my joint through these ranges of motion is I need more compression. And I get that by more muscle activity around the joint. And that, since I don't have a lot of area in the joint, increases the pressure per unit area, right? And I get more degeneration in my hip. So lifting heavy is not something my body is very good at. It's something that I've always wanted and I really like doing. But it was a long road to say, I mean, I don't know if we're talking about stretching, but what we're really talking about is centration of a joint, optimal coverage of a joint, because that's what then leads to having full mobility. It's not, it's not that my muscle needs to be longer.
Mm-hmm. So we are poo-pooing stretching right now. And maybe I think two things we should talk about next. Thing number one, what are specific use cases where stretching makes sense, potentially? And two, if we're sitting here saying, hey, stretching is not the option that we're going to use, but people still want to be improving range of motion and movement, what are potentially better options to actually create meaningful movement change, right? So let's start with the point number one of maybe let's hit, what are some specific use cases where stretching still can make sense? I'll lead with an example, a personal example. After certain types of surgery, when you need to reclaim range of motion at a joint, like UCL surgery on the elbow, Tommy John, or ACL surgery at the knee, the only way to really get that back, because we're talking tendon, right? Like you're essentially taking and creating a new ligament. You've got to get some range of motion back in that ligament. And that is very, very, very prolonged stretching, right? After Tommy John surgery, for example, you spend a preposterous amount of time just sitting like on a table with somebody just pulling on it and just kind of like massaging in that elbow region. And we're just slowly, like we're talking 20 to 30 minutes at a time to slowly reclaim full range of motion at that joint. That's the one real example that comes to mind for me where I'm like, okay, stretching still does make sense in that realm because that's the only way that you're going to get that back. Right. And then a quick note here. that I meant to bring up earlier, but forgot. When we start thinking about more muscular, right? Like muscle belly things. Another big bugaboo for me in stretching is you're not adding sarcomeres to the muscle, right? So again, it all comes back to, either what is that muscle attaching to, or what is the tone being sent to that muscle from the nervous system? Because if you were adding sarcomeres in series via stretching, then hey, maybe stretching does make sense, because then you're actually literally physically making the muscle longer. But knowing that we don't do that, that does not happen, then what are you trying to accomplish? Well, I'm either going to do something that influences where the muscle attaches, or I'm trying to influence, the tone coming from the nervous system to that muscle. That was another important point I wanted to bring up here, because a lot of times I think that's not talked about either. But I'll pass the ball to you.
Sure. So post-surgery is a good example of stretching that makes a lot of sense, especially those passive tissues. Like, I've used it on clients too. Like sometimes a sleeper stretch is actually appropriate. Sometimes I've seen a shoulder capsule that's actually tight after repositioning a joint and ensuring that you should have full mobility, but you still don't. Mm-hmm. So then what is limiting you? Well, it's the capsule. And at that point, the only thing you can do is maybe a little bit of soft tissue work and some low load, long duration kind of stretching. And you could even do the, moderate duration kinds of 30-second holds or whatever. The other main benefit or the need for stretching is just when you really do need more mobility. So this was actually another topic that I wanted to come up with, or talk about. But what I think people do, especially with their hamstrings, is they go and they stretch and it feels tight, and they say that it's tight and it's limited and it needs to be increased. When you're at full tension, it should feel tight. So let's regardless of that though, what people are not usually doing is measuring, hey, what is a normal amount of movement for me? And so straight leg raise is the best way to test that. You just lay on your back, keep your leg totally straight, knee totally locked out. And you keep one leg down on the ground, knee, like I like to put a towel underneath the knee. Well, I like to tell people to put a towel underneath the knee and on the straight leg that's down on the ground. And if you lose contact with that, you've cheated and you have to stop this test. But you lay on your back, you put the straight leg, towel underneath the knee, down on the ground, and then you have the other leg straight, bring it up in an arc and see how high you can get it. And what we want is not necessarily full flexibility where you have access to this movement, but we want full mobility where you can pull your leg up there without the assistance of gravity or someone else. And usually I say if it looks like 80 degrees, I'm pretty happy with that. If you need more for whatever reason, maybe this is your particular body dysmorphia that you don't want to feel restricted, and you need to, if you go on Reddit r/flexibility, you see a lot of this. Like people are really, really flexible and they need more of it. If that is the goal, like these positioning exercises aren't going to get you to these extra normal, superhuman levels of flexibility. To do that, you're going to actually have to stretch, and you're going to have to stretch a lot. It's going to come with a lot of problems. So I don't have any of my clients do it that way. But if you need to get past that 80 degrees of straight leg raise, that's the way to do it.
I think another example here where the stretching can work, and again, I think hopefully people are picking up on the theme here, when it's more of this joint capsule related realm and the passive structures in the joint, that's where stretching can make a lot of sense, versus muscular stretching does not make as much sense. I think maybe that categorization can be helpful for people, because my other example in this realm is we're thinking posterior hip capsule. Like I will still give somebody, say, like a left posterior hip capsule stretch and just be like, you're just going to hang out here for a while because that motherfucker is just like running into a brick wall, and we need to loosen that sucker up so we can get something into that joint, buy back a little bit of internal rotation on that left side, so we can actually maybe like squat and lunge and do these things, right? That's the only other example I was gonna mention in the where does stretching make sense category.
That's a great one. That's probably the one that I use the most, honestly. I use it so much that I made a it's way too long. It's like 16 minutes on walking through how to fix a pigeon stretch to worry about where the bones are positioned, and to still get that lengthening of that tissue, but not irrespective of all the other stuff that we had talked about earlier, that bony position that is so important.
Yep, for sure. Okay. So with that one knocked out, let's maybe talk about if we're not going to be stretching to try to improve range of motion, what do we actually like better? Right? Because I think you don't want to be those people who just sit here and poo-poo something, but then never propose your own potentially superior solution. So this sucks, but I have nothing else to recommend to you. Talk to you later. Bye. I hate those people. So I know that in our realm, when we're thinking about improving movement, and we have a very good track record of doing this, we tend to just approach it in a very different way, right? We're thinking first and foremost about the position of a rib cage and pelvis. And the simplest way I can think to approach that is I have yet to not really be very successful getting somebody more hamstring, more side abs, and more serratus and reaching. When I get them those three to help deal with big stiff quads and big stiff lats, almost unanimously across the board, I start seeing improvements in range of motion, tightness feel, like that subjective feedback you get is, oh, movement's feeling easier. I don't feel as tight. I don't feel as restricted. And you can see the exercise videos that come back from people as well. You're like, oh, that squat and lunge looks way better than it did, 6 to 8 weeks ago. That looks substantially easier. We're actually getting in and out of hips. Things are moving much better. And so another way to think about this is, I still love and utilize half kneeling, tall kneeling, split stance, these different stances and positions as much as I can, because a lot of times I'm just trying to think about creating tug of war situations, right? Like I'm going to say, okay, if I put you in a half kneeling position, if we can actually get you in a good half kneeling position with ears over ribs, over pelvis, over down knee, that tells me that I'm getting good side ab, having to control and manage that down lengthened quad. If we can get that position, I know that we're doing something pretty positive at the pelvis and the rib cage. And then I want to move on top of that and not have it just fall to pieces. Right? Like a half kneeling one arm landmine press is still a phenomenal way to improve movement. And that's where I think we're different is I'm always thinking about how do I take this and bake it into the training, because that's where I've had more success is just with the exercise selection, the coaching, the cueing, and the setup. We get movement changes from training, not from having people just lay around for 30 minutes.
I would add that periodization is a big part of that as well. If I'm doing let's think about this, right? So we talked about my shallow hips not being very good at managing high force activity, right? So if I want to do powerlifting, which I did previously, what's going to be the problem with that? So if I do a powerlifting program, I'm inherently doing reps of 6 or fewer, which means the weights are heavy. If I continuously do that and I never train, endurance or whatever, with something with, lower force, then my joints don't get time to recover. They don't get a break. So I need to one, consider who is this body that I'm working on? And then 2, I need to say, okay, well, if I diagnose, if I categorize myself like that and I say, I'm going to be a power lifter, as a coach, I might have to say, well, you're not going to be a very good one. And I don't want to be the person that says, don't do this. But I do want you, to enjoy training. And if I was training myself like that, I would say, well, we're going to have to be very cautious about how we periodize. And we're going to have to just see how your body responds. Because if we do 3 cycles back to back of weight optimized, force optimized, and then power optimized stuff, like that might be too much intensity, high volume or high intensity volume for you.
Yeah, I think the periodization in terms of the exercise selection around that is super important as well, right? And this is one that we see from a lot of people that come on board with us for the first time, coming maybe more from that background where you look at what their training looks like, and this is why I always like to think of patterns and stances. Like patterns and stances, I think, solve a lot of problems in this movement realm for us, right? And so we can basically say, okay, we have 4 major patterns, right? I have an upper push and upper pull, lower push, lower pull. And then you have different stances in that. I have bilateral, I have unilateral, half kneeling, tall kneeling, split stance, hook lying, etc. Right? And then on the upper push, upper pull, I obviously can move through an entire range there. I have decline, horizontal, incline, vertical. And so you can think about all the different, possible combinations that we can create with this. And you get a pretty wide swath of human movement from that. And I think a key question to ask yourself is, how limited is your exposure across that spectrum? Because without fail, the people who we get that are like, I hurt, I don't feel good, blah, 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 their exposure is usually really, really narrow. It's like, I only do bilateral things. And from an upper body standpoint, it's usually almost always just horizontal, maybe a little bit incline. There's no unilateral, there's no alternating. None of that stuff's been brought into their world. And so they're just like this really stiff, fucking 2x4 that can't do anything but just move in a straight line. And that's, again, another place where, well, if we just increase your exposure, right? Like, we can keep the big players at the front end of your workout. Like, let's still squat, bench, and deadlift. And, maybe we just choose better options there. Maybe instead of a low bar squat, we safety bar you. Maybe we trap bar. Maybe we put your feet up on the bench when we bench press so we can help manage this whole rib cage thing going on. But I found that just doing a better job with your accessory exercise selection makes such an enormous difference, right? If you're getting a large exposure across these different patterns and stances, that's going to help a lot in this movement range of motion realm. The more you limit that exposure, the more restricted you're going to be. And hey, to the periodization concept, there are times where you may very intentionally limit that exposure because you are trying to pattern yourself to be as good as you can at this one thing on a set day and time. Right? And so this is where the art of exercise selection and programming over time comes in.
And it is an art, but it's pretty systematic. Like, if you have an event that you need to prepare for, well, okay, like 8 weeks before, I'm going to be very like that. I'm just going to do that stuff. Mm-hmm. And that's a law of specificity. I totally agree with a lot of that. I would say a lot of people can manage doing a heavy bilateral thing, like really pushing themselves. And then as long as you have good accessory work, like, you can still get some training volume, some like muscle stimulus for muscle growth, or the endurance to support the strength. Because the main thing is where you're getting your strength out of that. It's the accessory work is to support the strength gains and the joints and the muscles that are going there. I would say that a lot of people that come to me tend to be broken. And for them, I like to get rid of the bilateral stuff altogether for a little bit. And I like to reintroduce it in a weird way. Like, month 2, you're not going to get back squats with bar on your back. But I'll give you some kind of squat that you can load. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, I think your main stuff needs to be unilateral type things. So that could be asymmetrical loading instead of bilateral loading. That could be, meaning like I'm doing a split squat, but I got one weight that's heavier, one weight that's lighter, or I've only got one weight, or I could do a single leg, single arm type of thing. And what that, you can, and I'm you, the listener who does Rebel Performance things, I can see the world where you take a unilateral movement and you make it a bilateral movement, right? If you hold your breath hard enough, then you can mess things up still. You can still introduce more stiffness than the looseness that you're introducing. So, for something like that, the principle that I try to teach is you need dissociation of various joints in your body. If I ask somebody to stand feet together and turn their body around as far as they can, there's a bunch of different joints that will help you turn. If you're, if you're really stiff through your rib cage, which is where most of the rotation should occur, hips and rib cage, if you're really stiff through those areas, then you're going to find another way. You're probably going to roll your ankle a lot, which might mean that you're prone to ankle sprains when you go and you finally do some, ultimate frisbee with your friends. Or if you have a history of knee problems, you're probably going to rotate through your knee, even though your knee's knocked out. It's just because you have that laxity. You're going to find it where you can get it. And that's why I think it's important for these accessory exercises that you choose to create this dissociation. Let's say your example, to make this a little more concrete, your example of half kneeling. I like chops and lifts. Easiest way, you just grab a weight and you kneel down. Let's say I'm on my right knee. I'm going to bring the weight down in both hands to my right hip, and then I'm going to bring it up to my left shoulder. And I create this diagonal. And when I do that, I want to make sure that I'm not rotating through my hips to get the weight up to my left shoulder. I want to keep my hips still and dissociate the things on top. Make the rotation come from the joints above that.
Yep, I really like that. I think the dissociation concept is incredibly important. And I think being able to check your ego and know maybe when it's time to pull out certain movements is also really important, right? Because sometimes you need to pull out. If you're trying to re-pattern and relearn, sometimes you need to take those things out for a set period of time, because if you keep doing them, you're never going to change that habit, right? Because every time you see it, you're just going to go right back to where you were. We got to break that, that chain, if you will, somehow for certain people, right? The people that are maybe a little bit more broken than others. But
yeah.
Lance, this has been fantastic. If you wanted people to walk away from this with just one thing, what would that one thing be?
I'm trying to come up with a run-on sentence to throw a bunch of things in. I would say, instead of chasing flexibility, chase joint dissociation. See if you can move joints independently of one another. And I think you'd be a lot better off. You'd get at least the 80% of your progress for the 20% effort.
Excellent. I love that. We will leave it at that. All right, fam. Everybody, thank you for listening. Have a fantastic week, and we will be back next Monday. All right, thanks for tuning in.